So welcome to the video lecture series on Introduction to Computer Networks. This is part 4 of our lecture on the topic of common protocols which are used on the internet. So we will jump to the point from where we left off, which is going to be the Hypertext Transfer Protocol, or HTTP, and the secure version of HTTP, which is Hypertext Transfer Protocol Secure. So HTTP is used for pretty much most, if not all, communication between a web browser and a web server. So whenever you are hitting URL from the web browser, the contents that is retrieved from the web server is transferred using the Hypertext Transfer Protocol. So the web server is specified using a Uniform Resource Locator, short for URL. An example would be example.com/webpage.html. So this particular URL, it can be broken down into 3 parts. So the first part is HTTP, which defines the protocol or the scheme which will be used to retrieve the contents. Second is going to be the name of the server. So this is the domain name of the server that will be used, including the top level domain, that is .com. And followed by the slash, we have webpage.html, which is the name of the specific file that is being requested from the server. So as discussed previously in the topic of DNS, the server name example.com first needs to be resolved into an IP address using the DNS server. So once that is done, the client browser basically sends an HTTP request to the server, which in almost all cases runs on port 80 and receives a response. So the common HTTP requests are these 3. The first one is a GET request, which is used to request contents from a server. The second one is a POST request, which is generally used. It's an HTTP request, but it's of type POST, and this is used to upload data that the user is entering, for example, in a form, in a website, or trying to transfer something from the client browser into the server. And finally, there is a PUT HTTP request, which is used to upload resources onto a web server, which could be, for example, when you're trying to upload a file, and the contents of the file will be transferred using the HTTP PUT request. So when the server receives an HTTP request, it could be any of these 3, GET, POST, or PUT. The server responds with many possible replies. And there are different categories of responses. And these are the 5 different response categories. The 1XS format, which could be anything starting with 1, and the second 2 digits could be anything, and this is the category of informational responses. So this means that the server is letting the client know that the request that it received was received properly and is currently now being processed. The second kind is a 200 level response, and this implies any possible response that is that implies that the request was successfully received, understood, and accepted. The most common is a 200 OK. So the 200 OK implies that the request, whatever the HTTP request was, has been processed and received properly. The third is a 300 level request, and this implies a form of redirection, and which means that the client needs to perform some further action to be able to complete the given HTTP request. The 400 and the 500 level responses are both for errors. 400 level is implying a client-side error. 500 level is a server-side error. So a client-side error means that there is something bad in terms of the syntax or the format of the HTTP request. And on the other hand, a 500 level server error response means that the server um, received a valid request. However, something happened on the server end which made it run into an error, and it cannot process the request. So if you look at a very simple few examples of HTTP messages, first of all, HTTP messages work in a very much request response format over TCP/IP or even UDP, and the requests are sent from HTTP clients, commonly web browsers, and the HTTP server is a server which is running on port 80. So a sample HTTP request may look like this: get/http/1.0 host place.com, and this means that get me this particular homepage using HTTP version 1.0. Subsequently, this particular message where you have a get line, a host, and an additional parameter for accept language, this reads as get me the contents of this particular file from this URL by using HTTP version, but there is a preference of language, which is English first, followed by French, and then German. And finally, the third example of another GET request could have a specific parameter if modified since with a particular date, and this means that the contents of this URL is being requested. However, if the page has been modified since the specific date. So only if the contents of the page is later has been modified later than May 15, 2015, only then it will be returned to the HTTP client. The problem with HTTP is that all messages are sent in clear text. And as a result, it's not secure, and it can easily be intercepted by an attacker on the network and can be sniffed easily. So the secure version of HTTP is HTTP Secure or HTTPS. And HTTPS is used to establish a secure connection with the web server. And when it establishes the secure connection from the client to the server, it enforces authentication and also encryption to make sure that these messages, the requests and response messages, are being properly encrypted and protected from any outsider or attacker in the network. And one very important thing is that most commonly an HTTP server runs on port 443 instead of port 80, which is common for HTTP, right? And there are also additional rules which can be specified by HTTP for passing the data between the application layer and the transport layer in the TCP/IP model. So it makes it inherently secure during the process of the message being transferred from the web browser, from the application layer, all the way to the network, to the web server over the internet, and then all the way back. And an example of HTTPS request actually starts off with the HTTPS protocol specification. And whenever a URL starts like this, that means that anything that will be sent and received for this request and response will be secure. Next, we will look at the basic idea and examples of the common email protocols. So email protocols are separated into two broad categories. The first one is the class of submission and delivery protocols. So submission or delivery means that it enables emails to be submitted to the email server and also have the server send the email to another email server across the network. And the most common example for this kind of protocol is the SMTP server, that is the Simple Mail Transfer Protocol. The second class or the second category of email protocol, we call these retrieval protocols. And the basic idea of these protocols is that we can use these protocols to access or download emails from our specific email server. And we have two common protocols for this category, that is the POP or the Post Office Protocol, and also IMAP, that is the Internet Message Access Protocol. So in broad, email protocols are classified in two categories, one for submission and delivery across different servers, and another one is basically to be able to read an email that you just received. So if you just look at the way that they can be organized, the protocols and the servers, so let's say we have two users, Anna and Lav, who are in two different network domains. So Anna will be using SMTP to send out an email to its own mail server. The same way, Lav will be using SMTP to send out an email to its own mail server in XYZ. The two mail servers in mail domain ABC and mail domain XYZ needs to use SMTP to be able to push the emails between these two domains. All right, so SMTP here is being used to send emails from the user to the mail server, and also to push the email or forward the email from one mail server to another. However, at a later time, if Anna has an email waiting in its own mail server, it can use the POP or the IMAP protocol to retrieve the email and read it. The same would apply for Lav, is that it can use the POP or IMAP to retrieve and read the email that it has waiting in its own mail server.